without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, a Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Greetings. Thanks, Ellen. It's good to be with you. I think we're going to go off camera here to make it easier to show the slides. Thanks for joining us for our final Inside Track webinar for 2022. It is the post-midterm edition. We have lots of fun data to go through with you today as we sort of do a little bit of a roundup of what happened, and then a little bit of a look forward to 2023 and 2024, the next presidential election. Of course, it is never too early to start talking about the next election. Donald Trump has already announced, of course, but let's get into it. So our agenda today is first, just a brief recap of what happened in the election. Second, a little bit of a deeper dive into the election results and exactly what led us to sort of the place where we ended up, where the Democrats had a surprisingly strong showing. And then three, I'll be handing it over to Sarah, my colleague, our senior data journalist, to do that look ahead to 2024. All right, so the recap. So just a reminder, what we were sort of expecting to happen at the beginning of the year based on our base rate model, based on sort of a broad, big picture understanding of the election fundamentals, was that we expected Republicans to make gains, but we thought the most likely scenario was that it would be narrower Republican wins, that they'd most likely take control of the House of Representatives, but that the Senate was going to be a toss-up. And when we look at actually what happened, that's pretty close to what we see in reality. Next slide, please. So this is just again, another view of what we expected, what the races on the ballot was and what we expected. 75% chance, we said, of Republicans taking the House, 55% chance that Democrats were going to retain the majority in the Senate. And then we expected the Democrats to make some small gains in governor's mansions and the number of governor's mansions that they controlled. And the results actually bear this out. We're pretty close to what our forecast was. Indeed, Republicans have taken control of the House of Representatives by a small amount. It hasn't fully been tallied up, but they're likely to have about a 5-seat majority when everything's all said and done. There's one Senate race that remains to be decided. That's the Georgia Senate race that has gone to a runoff that will be happening after Thanksgiving, the first full week of December, between Democrat Raphael Warnock and Republican Herschel Walker. But because the Democratic Party holds the presidency and the vice presidency with Kamala Harris, they have a tie-breaking vote. So the fact that they were able to pick up one Republican seat in Pennsylvania, that was the John Fetterman-Mehmet Oz race that Fetterman won, they essentially have control of the chamber for the next 2 years, and what happens in Georgia is essentially just sort of gravy on top for them potentially if Raphael Warnock does end up able to win that election. And then in the gubernatorial races, we do see Democrats picking up 2 governor's mansions. So again, some small gains. These were mostly governor's mansions in the Northeast that had been held by Republicans, like for instance in Maryland or Massachusetts, that were picked up. But otherwise, most of the governor's races, we saw the incumbents win. So what happened? Lots of things. It was a very interesting and challenging election, big picture. But one of the things that was the main issue driving public opinion or driving sentiment around the election was, of course, the economy and inflation price pressures that we saw. And we're not seeing a significant impact on consumer sentiment about the economy post-election. So this is from our Ipsos Consumer Confidence Tracker. Every 2 weeks, we're out talking to about 1,000 Americans, asking them how they feel about the economy. This is our overall index number, and you can see that for the last few months, it's been relatively flat. It has not changed appreciably. And we did not see particularly any significant change based on partisan viewpoints. That is, Democrats and Republicans haven't shifted position, which is unlike what we saw in 2020, where Republicans went from being much more optimistic about the economy before Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden in the 2020 election to being more pessimistic. We're essentially seeing status quo, which to our eyes means that the election is being perceived in the American public as sort of a continuation of the status quo, a continuation of sort of the 2020 to 2022 series, and particularly that Republicans are not feeling very good about what's happened in the election. They're not feeling sort of emboldened because we're not seeing a spike in their consumer sentiment. Next. So this is, again, you've seen this before. This is a chart showing the number of seats gained or lost in each midterm by the president's party. The average at the top in the House, 26 seats lost, Senate, 4 seats lost, and then where the Democratic Party is as of last Friday. They've lost 9 seats in the House. They gained 1 seat potentially in the Senate. Again, the Georgia runoff may change that. If Democrats lose the Georgia runoff, that would go to a 0. If they win it, it would stay as a +1 because the seat is currently held by a Democrat. But that is a pretty strong showing for the Democrats, historically speaking. It's not the best ever showing, of course, for a party in power. You can go back to Bill Clinton's second midterm or George W. Bush's first midterm, where they actually gained some seats. But it is a pretty decent showing, all things considered. The Democrats lost relatively few seats compared to what expectations were going in. People were really sort of more thinking that this was going to be more like what Donald Trump experienced in 2018, or even what Barack Obama experienced in 2010, where the seat loss in the House was double digits, 40, up to 63 seats. But that red wave, as it was referred to, did not materialize. Next. And I think that's happening because of a couple of different factors. And one of them is that we're seeing participation in midterm elections trending upwards in sort of the Trump era of American politics, sort of the post-2016 era. Historically speaking, midterms have been relatively low turnout affairs. This is the percentage of the vote age eligible population who participated, who voted in the midterm for the past 70 years. And you can see really since the 1970s, it's rarely cracked 40% of the voting age eligible population taking part. Indeed, in 2014, it was particularly low at 37%. But the 2018 election, were half of the population, and then this year we're 46%, and that's likely to climb as some of the late vote is tallied up. Probably will be north of 47% when everything's all said and done. Represents really a return to pretty high levels of turnout. And this is essentially sort of the side effect of this very polarized, this very sort of anxiety-producing era of American politics, where people are frightened, they care very strongly, so they're showing up to vote, right? The stakes seem to be high, and that is driving higher turnout. So it's sort of a positive side effect, I guess, of how sort of scary things are right now, is that it is actually helping drive people out to vote. So that's sort of one of the first things, right? We're seeing big turnout, and while it's not a universally true maxim, higher turnout does tend to help Democrats, because Democrats do have pieces of their coalition that tend to vote at slightly lower rates. So higher turnout means that they're sort of showing up to vote, they're taking part. Next. The other thing that's important to note, though, is that turnout is not necessarily equally distributed across the country. This is the turnout rate by state in the midterm elections. And I want to point out a couple of things to you. One, a bunch of the swing states actually had very high turnout. So this is places like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona. We had really high turnout in those places relative to some of the neighboring states. And I think, again, this is a testament to how sort of much people felt like this election mattered, right? So if you had a close Senate election, particularly a close Senate election, we saw very high turnout in those states. Another thing to note, though, is that there are a couple of states where the turnout's not so great. So in the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, relatively low turnout in those states. But also in California and New York, relatively low turnout. And one thing that actually seems to be becoming more clear is that Democratic turnout, particularly in California and New York, which are very blue, very Democratic states, was somewhat subdued. And I think if the Republicans won control of the House of Representatives, a lot of it is because of gains they made in those two Democratic-leaning states. That they were able to pick up seats in those states, and that sort of has made the difference, right? So Democrats were mobilized in places where it felt like it mattered, but in places where it didn't necessarily seem to matter, that mobilization was not as strong, and that led to sort of more typical midterm patterns where the party out of power, the Republican Party this year, makes bigger gains. Next. And this is a different way of sort of looking at that. This is grouping turnout in the states by a couple of different factors. And one of the ones that is, I think, most interesting or most important is if abortion was on the ballot. Abortion was on sort of state referendums or ballot initiatives in a number of states. And we can see that in the states where it was on the ballot, turnout was about 5 percentage points higher than in other states where it wasn't. And we saw this even earlier this year. Kansas had a special referendum, which ended up having very high turnout where abortion rights were secured by a large majority of the Kansas population. And this played out in a number of other elections in the midterms in places like Michigan or Kentucky. Really across the board, abortion seemed to, legalized abortion seemed to win pretty much everywhere it was on the ballot, and it definitely drove higher turnout. Also, places that had gubernatorial races, places that had Senate races, places that, where things are sort of competitive, saw higher turnout than places where those elections were not happening. But even sort of digging into the places that had competitive Senate or competitive governor elections had higher turnout than the places that did not. Next. This is looking at the exit poll data. Again, you could always sort of caveat exit poll data. It's not a perfect data collection mechanism, stopping people as they vote. It has some hits and misses. But one of the interesting things that happened is people expected this year for the Democratic parts of the population to not vote at high rates. 2018, very strong Democratic year. People were expecting this to be more of a Republican-looking year, but that does not seem to be what happened. So what we see in the 2022 data is that, yes, there was a little bit of a drop-off in young vote, percentage point in the 18 to 29-year-old, a percentage point in the 30 to 44-year-old, a slight increase in the older vote. But there was no real difference in terms of race, ethnicity, Black and Latino voters. And this is, I think, important because, again, these are voting groups, young people and minority voters who are heavily Democratic. And without their presence in the electorate, in the voting electorate, Democrats would have likely been wiped out. So the fact that they showed up to vote, just another indication of how Democrats were able to mobilize their supporters to really counterbalance what the Republicans were doing. Next. And this is this next slide shows just sort of what the vote looks like by some of those different categories. So again, young people voting Democratic, minority Americans voting Democratic as well, white voters, older voters voting Republican. White voters and older voters vote in almost all the midterms, so that's sort of like a standard sort of piece of the population. And the real X factor, right, is how many young people, how many minority Americans take part. And we saw, again, high turnout in those groups. Next. And the issues that were driving the election were actually interesting when you sort of drill down below that top line number. So we looked at the beginning, we were talking about how inflation in the economy was the main issue facing the country. We definitely see that in pretty much every way we asked the survey. But when you narrow it down to who's actually taking part, and remember, it's less than half of the country that is voting, we see the issue landscape really changing, and particularly among Democratic voters, political extremism major issue, 56% listing that as one of their biggest worries. Climate change, abortion, race and racism, economic inequality, all of these issues were very important for Democratic voters. A lot of that was what the Democratic Party, what President Biden, former President Obama were talking about in their closing arguments with voters. And that, I think, helped sort of give the Democrats something to focus on, something to mobilize around, other than just the economy kind of sucks and the Democrats aren't doing a great job with it, which would have been sort of the prevailing narrative if Dobbs had not happened this summer, the Supreme Court ruling that struck down Roe v. Wade, the national right to abortion. And on the Republican side, we do see inflation definitely the number one issue, but there are other issues that are also very important in the Republican mindset, including immigration, including government budget, and including election security. These issues that were very sort of top of mind for Republicans going into the election, but didn't necessarily seem to motivate sort of a larger swath of the country. Next. And then in the exit poll, right, this is again the surveys being done with people as they're leaving the voting booth. We saw that abortion was even more important as a single issue. If people are asked, what's the one thing, just over a quarter of American voters said that abortion was their sort of number one issue, which again, I think speaks to how much impact that Dobbs decision and then sort of the Democratic messaging about it after the fact, and sort of the fears that Republicans were going to outlaw abortion. So some of the state measures states were doing post-Dobbs to outlaw abortion really drove a big chunk of the electorate to show up this year that may not have done so otherwise. The other thing that is a really interesting factor is the impact of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was very involved in the election on the Republican side, endorsing a lot of different Republican candidates. But it appears to be that Trump's effect on the party, or sort of the MAGA, the Make America Great Again movement sort of broadly, had a pretty negative effect on Republican performance overall. This is looking at performance in the House of Representatives, the congressional races. And if you look at the competitive districts, that is races that were relatively close, they're not safe Republican or safe Democratic districts, places where the MAGA Republican was the Republican candidate, underperformed relative to 2020. In fact, Democrats did slightly better in those districts than they did in 2020 compared to more generic or general Republicans, people who didn't have necessarily that same MAGA branding that or Trump endorsement that they did, who ended up actually overperforming the 2020 numbers in those districts. This is an analysis that Nate Cohn did from the New York Times. And we see this in a number of other places. So in Georgia, for instance, Brian Kemp, the Republican governor of the state, cruised to re-election relatively easily. And he's sort of well known for sort of standing up to Trump in the 2020 post-election period where Trump was really leaning on Georgia to sort of find him some votes to win the election. But Herschel Walker, the Republican Senate candidate who was closely identified with Trump, ended up actually coming in a close second to Raphael Warnock in the vote. Of course, neither of them got over that 50% threshold to avoid the runoff, so it's going to a runoff anyways. But again, you can see the MAGA candidates underperforming sort of generic Republicans. And I think that really says in a lot of ways that Republicans kind of got in their own way this year. With the Supreme Court and the Dobbs decision, with Republican state legislatures pushing aggressively on abortion, making abortion illegal in states that they controlled, and sort of continually sort of pushing back on fights about the election, 2020 election legitimacy, the Trump-endorsed secretaries of state who were making noises about, never having another Democratic win election, things like that. It gave Democrats something to run against, and it gave them something to really mobilize their base in a way that, again, I think more generic Republicans, more sort of typical Republicans didn't. We saw that play out in the results. All right, now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk about what to expect in the future, because it's never too early to start talking about the next election. Sarah?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. We barely caught our breath from the 2022 midterms, and here we are talking about the presidential election in 2024. That is what the news media cares about. That's what I know a lot of Americans care about, talking to friends and family. So we're going to spend some time talking about that today. So to kick us off for this section, here we're looking at some polls that we did with USA Today in August and November of this year. So we have a really nice pre-post-election read on Americans' attitudes towards Democratic and Republican Party leadership. And what we found by conducting these polls is that while Trump's support for being the GOP nominee for president in 2024 remains strong among Republican voters, his position among that group has softened somewhat since this summer. And it seems like that's in part because of the midterm performance Chris just ran down for us. Fewer Republicans feel that Trump can win elections. Now, one caveat there, while that is a kind of bombshell finding, is that still 75% of Republican voters feel that the former president can win elections, though that has softened somewhat, come down since August. Now, in that same poll, we asked a similar question about President Biden. We asked Democratic voters whether they think President Biden should be the Democratic nominee for president in 2024. In August, less than half of Democratic voters felt that Biden should be the nominee. Following the midterms, Biden gained 6 points on this question among Democratic voters, indicating this group is feeling a bit better about the prospect of the sitting president running for re-election in 2024. Perhaps because of his midterm performance related to that, the president gained ground on a couple of key attributes. More Democratic voters feel he is willing to use all the tools at his disposal to get things done. Many feel he has new ideas, is electable, is an effective communicator, campaigner. Now, Biden had strong support among Democrats on these attributes pre-election. He's just solidified that support post-election. And whether or not Biden runs for re-election has significant consequences for Democrats' chances of holding the White House in 2024. We'll get into what the numbers say about that a bit below and some of the relationships Ipsos data and models have on that, but I just want to set that stage for that now as we're talking about Biden and some re-election prospects. So we talked a bit about Biden's success, the ground he has gained post-midterm. Now we're going to turn to a question that's really hanging in the air for the president. Is he too old for re-election? This weekend, President Biden celebrated his 80th birthday. And, for that matter, much of political leadership in the US is quite old. Trump is 76, McConnell is 80, Nancy Pelosi, who did just step down from her leadership position in the House, is 82. And, on average, political leaders in the US are older than other democracies. And when we ask Americans in a poll we did with Reuters directly following the election, whether these political leaders are too old to work in government, most Americans, regardless of partisanship, feel that they are. The one exception here is Republicans and their relationship to Donald Trump. Only 1 in 3 Republicans think Trump is too old to work in government. But that notwithstanding, by and large, there is an appetite for younger representation. But what that might look like and who that might be certainly are still open questions. The current standard bearers of the party win the highest favorability ratings from their respective bases. Donald Trump's favorables sit at 75% among Republican voters. Biden is at 81% among Democratic voters. Some other leaders who've been talked about as possible successors, like Nikki Haley among Republicans or Gavin Newsom for Democrats, don't have favorables that are as strong as Trump and Biden, respectively. And this is largely because they're mostly unknown on the national scale. Ron DeSantis, though, is one exception to this rule. Ron DeSantis is the current governor of Florida who just won re-election in this cycle, and his favorables sit just under former President Trump's. Now, if you've been following the election coverage since the midterms, you'll know that there's this growing chatter about a DeSantis versus Trump face-off. And this narrative is in part coming from the sense from Republicans that their party's leadership can't win elections, and they're looking for people who can fix that. And the data seems to reflect this weakening confidence among Republicans in their party's leadership to win elections. So, there is certainly some opportunity for new Republican leadership to take hold. It seems like an appetite for that among the public. Somewhat, I want to caveat that Trump is still quite favorable among the Republican base, but whether or not that happens is just a whole different story. There is a ton of time between now and 2024, even between now and the Republican primaries. So we'll just have to wait and see and watch how this develops and track it here in our webinar series. But looking at the other side of the ticket, Democratic voters, on the other hand, are feeling much more positively about their leadership's ability to win elections. And this has certainly helped Biden's re-election argument. But one thing that is still kind of dragging Biden is his presidential approval ratings. And one thing to note for thinking about presidential elections, for analyzing presidential elections, presidential approval matters. Right now, Biden's hovering on around the high 30s, low 40s, which is a pretty precarious spot to be in. I'm sure he'd love to see those numbers a bit higher. It doesn't appear that he's had a boost in his approval ratings following, some of the favorable news coverage for Democrats coming out of the election. And just something to remember there. While this has been a favorable news cycle for Democrats, while this has been a largely favorable cycle for Democrats to some extent, it is important to remember that midterms typically say nothing about the next general election. But a president's approval rating generally does have some bearing on presidential electoral outcomes. And, again, now it's only November 2022, so we're very far out from when this stuff really starts to kick in and matter. But I'm just going to outline what the relationship between approval ratings and winning elections look like for incumbents, which in this case would be President Biden and their successors, which would be any Democrat who would take the reins from Biden should he not run for re-election. And we can see that a government needs at least a 40% approval rating to have a better than 50-50 chance of winning an election. A successor, on the other hand, needs a much higher approval rating to have a better than 50-50 chance of winning the election, which is to say that there are some costs to being a successor. Now here, just to give you some context to the slide, government approval is just presidential approval rating. In the US, it's very simple. Presidents are largely viewed as the government, so that's the input for this table and for our base rate model, which this is based off of. So digging a bit deeper into our base rate model, we've looked at numerous US and global elections where the chief executive is up for re-election and modeled how approval ratings and incumbency work to increase the odds of a candidate winning. Incumbents have an advantage. If their approval is not too bad, their chances of winning dip as their approval does. Successors have a bit of a steeper slope decline. They need the government, again, which is in this case the president's approval ratings, to hover around 55% for the odds that they'll win to tip in their favor. So whether or not Biden should run, and if he doesn't, who will replace him, and what his approval ratings look like, and all of that combined all hold significant implications for whether Democrats can win re-election to the White House in 2024. So, when you're sitting around your Thanksgiving dinner table, if you're celebrating that, when you're talking with your colleagues about the election, this is really the space to watch as questions about Biden's re-election get fought out in the public and we're all grappling with what might happen next. So that's all of our data for our Inside Track post-election webinar. I'll turn it over to Chris, who will take your questions. We'll run through them together.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So yeah, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function in the meeting, GoToWebinar meeting application. You can punch anything in and we will happily answer whatever questions we can. All right, so first question, referencing the point I made about the Senate and what the Senate runoff, not insignificant difference between power sharing and a clear majority in the Senate. Yeah, I mean, I think I was maybe a little glib about the importance of what happens in Georgia. I think, it will be important However, with the Republicans taking control of the House of Representatives, we're unlikely to see a lot of new legislation getting passed through in any sort of major way, shape, or form. So the fact that the House is remaining Democratic, or sorry, is going Republican, the Senate is remaining Democratic, basically means that we're going to sort of have a bit of legislative gridlock for the next 2 years. And the fact that the Democrats have 50 or 51 seats isn't fundamentally going to change the nature of that gridlock. It may change it around the margins slightly because, for instance, Democrats may not have to negotiate both with Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin. They're sort of two more conservative members if they end up with 51 seats. But again, with the House going Republican, we're not really expecting to see lots of significant legislation coming through. Other question, given the GOP House mandate to drag Biden through the mud, i.e. House hearings and investigations, do you think that could backfire on them or will it be successful? It remains to be seen, I think. The House Republicans are definitely going to be very aggressively going after Joe Biden, going after the Biden administration, probably going after the Biden family, given sort of the fixation on Hunter Biden. Historically speaking, these kind of things have not worked super great for Republicans. We can go back to the Clinton administration, and after Clinton was impeached for basically having an affair, though it was perjury technically, he actually got more popular with the American public. The American public sort of looked at it, thought that the charges that the Republican Party was levying against him were sort of trivial and that the Republicans were not sort of working in the best interest of the country, and sort of rewarded them. And that was one of those two instances that the incumbent party actually picked up seats in the midterms in that 1998 midterm election. Likewise, the Obama administration, Republicans went after the Obama administration numerous times, and it never really seemed to damage Obama. He remained moderately popular through his presidency and has become very popular since he's left office. So I think electorally, it's sort of a bit of a grab bag in how well it works. But I do think that the American people, outside that 20 to 30%, that are hardcore Republican voters, can sort of evaluate charges and sort of decide for themselves a little bit in how serious or not serious they are. I think Republicans are trying to do a little bit of a tit for tat kind of thing. If, you impeach Trump, we're going to impeach Biden. But Trump fomented a riot that, may or may not have been targeting at overthrowing the government. And Biden's son has some drug problems, not necessarily the same level of misbehavior, perhaps, if anything. So yeah, I think it remains to be seen what the impact of these is going to be. I can tell you that it's probably going to be pretty exhausting for everybody else for the next 2 years. If you want to sort of stick your head in the sand and come back up in 2 years, it might be better for your mental health. Next question. If potentially strong Republican candidates such as DeSantis don't enter the race by early to mid 2023, will that be helpful for Trump to regain momentum? Yeah, I think that's a great question. Trump's announcement last week that he was running wasn't actually the earliest we've seen of anyone announcing that they're running for president. It's maybe a few months earlier than average, but only slightly. I think it will be an interesting question over the next 12 months if a serious Republican challenger does step up to go up against Donald Trump. I think if he does not see a serious challenger like DeSantis, it does probably help Donald Trump re-secure the loyalty of the Republican Party. Because one thing we've seen is that Republicans are very, very good about sort of circling the wagons around their side if the other option is that a Democrat wins, right? And we saw that in 2016. Remember, Trump didn't actually win the majority of votes in the primary, but Republican voters after the primary very quickly and very solidly got behind the Trump candidacy and, propelled him to that surprise 2016 win. That being said, there is, I think, a pretty significant appetite within Republican voters for another option, for someone like DeSantis to run. I think DeSantis's star is definitely on the ascent. As Sarah was talking about, he's seen as a winner. Trump is not seen as a winner for the moment, even within Republican circles. I'm sure DeSantis is running his own research, and will make his own decisions on whether to run or not. But at least at the moment, it looks like he's in a good position to challenge. I don't think any of the other sort of moderate Republicans would present the same kind of challenge, right? Like the Larry Hogans, former Maryland governor, or any of those. Like, that's just not where the Republican Party is right now. And the way to sort of tell, the way to keep track is to keep watching conservative media. Keep watching the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal's editorial pages, Fox News. The New York Post has turned relatively hard against Trump since the election, very sort of pro-DeSantis the last couple of weeks rather. And I think as long as that's the case, the win's going to be in Trump's face. But if you do see these sort of conservative media organs turning back behind Trump, getting back behind Trump, then that will be indicative of the party falling in line. All right, let's see. What other questions do we have? That's all the questions I see. If anyone else has one they'd like to submit here in the next minute, by all means. Otherwise, thank you again for taking time out here on the Thanksgiving week to join us for our Inside Track webinar. This is our last one of the 2022 season. We will restart the series next year in February as we start to look towards the 2024 election, but also to track all of the political and social trends as we start moving forward. Oh, we do have another question in. With the expectation this will be an exhausting news cycle, what do you think the landscape looks like for new channels, larger viewers, news channels, larger viewers or less so? Sarah, do you want to comment on what we expect the news environment for broadcasters to be, news outlets?
Sure. A small question to round us out for this last Inside Track session of 2022. I mean, I think what we're seeing is that many people are still tuning into cable news, as Chris said in his response to the DeSantis-Trump chatter. Republican conservative media certainly still drives a lot of coverage, a lot of change, and I think we can expect that to continue moving into the next cycle. I think Trump's presence on Twitter is going to be kind of an open question as Elon Musk opened him up. Social media is still very important. It's a fractured media environment, but there's still some heavyweights in it, like cable news, like the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, New York Times, etc. And they certainly still have a voice and a say when it comes to how elections get covered.
All right, great. Thank you, Sarah. So again, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate your time. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and then we will talk in 2023. Take care, everyone.